She found him half in the creek and half out of it, face down in the mud where the current had dropped him against a fallen cottonwood. And for one long breath Selah Pruitt was certain she had found only a body to bury. Then his hand moved. She was down the bank, and into the icy water before she'd thought the decision through, her skirts dragging like anchors, her boots filling with the creek's black cold. And she got her arms under the stranger's shoulders and heaved him toward the bank with a strength she did not know she still possessed. He was a big man, unconscious, his face swollen and cut, his shirt soaked through with blood that had long since gone brown, and when she finally got him onto the grass, she pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw and found, faint and stubborn as a moth against glass, a pulse. "Well," she said aloud, to no one, because there was no one else for 2 miles in any direction, "I suppose you're not finished yet." She did not know, kneeling there in the mud on the edge of her own failing homestead near Dry Bluff, that the man she was dragging home behind her old mule was the richest cattleman in the territory. She knew only that he was dying, that she had exactly $4 and a widow's pension of pride standing between herself and the poorhouse, and that she was going to save him anyway, because Selah Pruitt had buried a husband 3 winters past and had promised herself, standing over that grave, that she would never again let a person die within reach of her hands without trying everything she had to stop it. It took her the better part of an hour to get him into the wagon bed and back to the house, and another hour after that to cut away his ruined shirt, clean the gash along his ribs, and set what she was fairly certain was a cracked collarbone with 2 splints of kindling, and a strip torn from her own petticoat. He had no papers on him, no watch, no ring, nothing to say who he was or where he'd come from, only a fine leather boot on one foot and a bare, blistered one where the other boot had been stolen, which told her plainly enough that whoever had left him for dead in the creek had also robbed him first. Selah's own homestead was not much of a place to bring a dying man to recover in, and she knew it better than anyone. 3 winters back, her husband Amos had gone out after a strayed heifer in an early blizzard and never come home, found 2 days later frozen against a fence line half a mile from the house he'd built her with his own hands. She had buried him in the little cemetery behind the Dry Bluff church and come home to 60 acres, a leaking roof, a mule, and a debt she hadn't known existed until the bank sent its first letter. She had made her living since on what a widow with steady hands and her mother's knowledge of healing herbs could manage mending for the wives of Dry Bluff who could spare a little coin, doctoring livestock for neighbors too proud to call the vet from town, and stretching a garden's yield across a winter that always seemed longer than the last. It was not a comfortable life. It was, however, entirely her own, and she guarded that ownership the way some women guarded jewelry. She had made her promise at Amos's graveside on a cold April morning, the dirt still raw over him, when she had understood all at once that she had not been there to save him, had not even known he was dying until it was already done, and had sworn to herself, kneeling in that mud in her one good morning dress, that she would never again stand by helpless while someone bled or froze or starved within reach of her hands, whatever it cost her to intervene. It was a vow made in grief rather than sense, and she had kept it twice already in 3 years, once for a peddler's mule that had broken its leg on the road, and once for a runaway apprentice boy she'd fed and hidden from a cruel master for a week before delivering him safely to relations in the next county. She meant to keep it a 3rd time now, for a nameless stranger dragged out of a creek, whatever the cost turned out to be. "You'll want a name eventually," she told the unconscious man, working honey and crushed herbs into the wound along his side by lamplight. "I don't suppose you can offer one just now. I'll call you Mr. Cricket then, for the sound you're making, until you can do better." He did not stir for 2 days. Sela spent those 2 days doing arithmetic. She hated $4, minus what the willow bark and the honey and the last of her flour would cost her. Minus the price of the fever powders, she'd have to ride into Dry Bluff to buy on credit from a druggist who already eyed her debts with disapproval. She had exactly enough, by her reckoning, to keep herself and a stranger alive through a bad fever for perhaps 10 days. She did not let herself think past those 10 days, because past them lay a note held against her homestead that would come due at the first frost, and a neighboring rancher named Garrett Voss, who had made no secret of wanting her 60 acres and the spring that watered them. Voss rode over on the third day, as if some instinct for other people's weakness had summoned him. "Heard in town you pulled a man out of the creek," he said, not dismounting, his shadow falling long and deliberate across her doorway. "Heard you've got him laid up in your front room. That's a bold thing for a woman alone to do, Mrs. Prewitt. Folks will talk." "Folks are welcome to talk," Sela said. "I'll not let a dying man rot in a ditch because gossip might follow." "Your note comes due in 6 weeks, Voss said, as though the two subjects were entirely related, which in his mind she understood they were. "I've told you I'd take the debt off your hands kindly if you'd sell me the spring quarter. You could keep the house, live out your days without the worry of it. And you'd own the water that keeps my garden and my well full," Sela said. "I know precisely what kindness that offer contains, Mr. Voss. The answer is the same as it was in the spring, and will be the same at the first frost. I'm not selling." Voss's smile did not reach his eyes. "6 weeks isn't so very long," he said, and rode off without another word, and Sela stood in her doorway a long moment after he'd gone, feeling the particular cold of a threat delivered politely, before she went back inside to change the cloth on her stranger's forehead. She rode into Dry Bluff the next morning for fever powders, and found the druggist, Mr. Otten, sliding his ledger toward her with a look that made his opinion plain before he spoke a word of it. "Your account's already carrying more than I like, Mrs. Prewitt," he said. "I heard you've got some vagrant laid up out at your place. Folks are asking whether it's wise, a widow alone tending a strange man nobody can vouch for." "Folks are welcome to tend him themselves if they've a mind to worry over it," Sela said, counting out what coins she had onto the counter, "though I noticed none of them offered before I pulled him out of the creek." "I'm not unsympathetic," Otten said, not meeting her eyes, "but a woman's reputation is a fragile thing in a small town, and yours has had enough strain on it since Amos passed without adding a mystery man to the ledger." "My reputation," Sela said evenly, "has survived 3 winters of exactly this sort of talk, Mr. Otten, and it will survive this too. I'll take the powders, and I'll settle the account the moment I'm able, as I always have." He sold them to her, grudging but honest, and she rode home past the churchyard where Amos lay, and past 3 women from the sewing circle who fell silent as she passed and resumed talking louder, once they judged her out of easy earshot. She had grown a thick enough skin for gossip over the years. It was the arithmetic that frightened her more. $4 dwindled now to less than 2. A debt at the druggist's growing beside the debt at the bank, and a stranger in her front room who might yet die despite everything she poured into keeping him breathing. He broke fever on the 5th night, thrashing so violently she had to hold him down with her whole weight across his chest, murmuring words that made no sense, a name, Whitcomb, repeated twice, and something about a ledger. And once, quite clearly, the water rights don't sign, before he went still, and his breathing evened out and his eyes, for the first time, opened. They were gray, clear even through the fever's haze, and they found her face in the lamplight with a kind of desperate concentration, as though he were trying to place her among 100 other faces and could not. Where, he managed, his voice a ruin. Dry Bluff, Sela said. A homestead 2 miles east of town. You've been fevered 5 days. I found you in the creek. Who, he said, and she understood with a small chill that he did not mean who was she. He meant who was he. You don't recall your own name. He shook his head, the smallest motion, and something like fear moved behind the gray eyes before exhaustion pulled him back under. Sela sat with that fear a long while after he'd slept again, turning it over. A man robbed, beaten, left to drown, and now emptied even of his own name. Whoever had done this to him had meant for there to be nothing left of him at all. The days that followed were the hardest, and though she would not have admitted it easily, some of the fullest of her widowhood. She fed him broth spoon by spoon when he was too weak to hold a cup. She read to him from her one worn Bible in the evenings when his fever climbed again, her voice low and steady in the small house, because she had heard once that the sound of a voice could anchor a mind adrift, and she found she believed it. Fragments returned to him unevenly. The smell of cattle, the sound of a train whistle, a woman's laugh he could not place a face to, the certainty that he had been traveling under a name that was not entirely his own, for reasons he could not yet recall. I keep thinking of ledgers, he told her one evening, 3 weeks in, sitting up now against a stack of pillows, color finally returned to his face. Numbers, contracts. I think I was a man who dealt in a great many things I can't put a shape to. A banker, perhaps, Sela said, threading a needle by the lamp, mending the same shirt she had cut from him weeks before. Or a lawyer. Perhaps, he agreed, though something in his tone said the guess did not sit right, and she let it go, because she had learned that pressing him only drove the fragments further from reach. She had learned, in those weeks, other things about him that had nothing to do with his forgotten name. She learned he hummed tunelessly when he was in pain and trying not to show it. She learned he had strong opinions about how a fence ought to be mended, and could not help himself from offering them, one-handed and half-splinted, from the porch chair she'd forbidden him to leave. She learned he asked after her husband gently and without prying, and listened when she told him about Amos, the fence line, the blizzard, the 2 days she hadn't known he was already gone, with a stillness that felt less like politeness than genuine grief on her behalf, for a man he'd never met. You loved him, Em said, the first time she told it whole. I did, Sela said. I don't expect that ever to change, whatever else changes around it. I've made my peace with carrying it. I wouldn't ask you to set it down, Em said. A man capable of being loved as thoroughly as you loved him must have been worth the grief. I find I'm not frightened of it, Sela. I'm only grateful you've room left in you for anything at all, after losing a man like that. It was a strange comfort, hearing her grief handled so plainly and so gently by a man with no name and no history of his own. And it was in that unguarded evening, more than any other, that Sela felt the last of her careful distance from him give quietly way. She marked, without quite meaning to, the small changes in herself that his presence had brought. She caught herself humming while she worked the garden, a habit she'd lost the winter Amos died. She found herself dressing her hair with more care of a morning than a woman feeding chickens and mending fences had any real reason to. She noticed, with something between amusement and alarm, that she had begun timing her chores so that she'd be near the house when he woke from his afternoon rest, rather than out at the far fence line where she used to prefer working alone. You're smiling, Em observed one evening, watching her set the table for two the way she'd once set it only for herself. I am, Sela admitted, echoing, without either of them noticing the echo, the very words he would come to say to her again in gentler company months later. I'd forgotten I still knew how. She had by then, stopped calling him Mr. Cricket. He had taken, in a rare flash of dry humor during a bad night, to calling himself simply M, a syllable that felt right to him though he couldn't say why. And Seela had taken to it easily, the way a name settles onto a person you've already decided to keep. It was not, she told herself firmly and often, that she had grown attached to a stranger with no history and no prospects, in a house that would not be hers past the first frost. It was only practical kindness, the same kindness she'd have shown any dying man pulled from a creek. But she noticed the particular quality of comfort in coming in from the henhouse, to find him mending the porch step he'd insisted on fixing despite his splinted collarbone, and the way his gray eyes followed her across a room now with a steadiness that had nothing to do with fever, and the small, treacherous hope that had begun, against every practical instinct she owned, to grow in the space where her grief for her husband had once lived entire. "You've given me your whole winter's stores," Em said one night, watching her portion out the last of the cornmeal with the careful precision of a woman who had long practiced stretching too little. "I've watched you do the arithmetic in your face for 3 weeks now, Seela. You're feeding a stranger who cannot pay you a cent, on a note that's coming due, and you haven't once asked me to leave." "You were dying," Seela said simply. "I don't require payment for not letting a man die in my front room." "Most would," Em said. "Most, having found me robbed and worthless, would have left me at the church steps in town and washed their hands of the trouble. You rode 2 miles to a druggist you couldn't pay and put my life ahead of your own roof." "I made a promise once," Seela said, "at a grave, that I wouldn't let that happen again if it was in my power to stop it. I don't regret keeping it, whatever it costs me by the first frost." Em was quiet a long moment, watching her in the lamplight. "Whoever I was," he said finally, "before the creek, I think he was not a man who deserved a woman like you. I intend, whoever I turn out to become one." Garrett Voss came again a week before the note fell due, this time with the county banker riding stiff and unhappy beside him, as though he'd been dragged along to lend the visit an official weight it didn't otherwise deserve. "I've come to be neighborly," Voss said, though nothing in his face suggested neighborliness, "and to remind you the bank won't extend kindness the way I've been willing to. Mr. Halsey here can tell you himself 60 acres, sold at auction for a debt this small, rarely fetches its true worth. A woman in your position ought to consider a private sale before the courthouse steps make the decision for her." "I'm aware of my position, Mr. Voss," Seela said, standing in her doorway with M silent and watchful just behind her shoulder, his weight still leaning on the doorframe more than he'd admit to. "I've been aware of it for 2 years. I don't require a banker's escort to remind me of arithmetic I've already done 100 times over." Halsey, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable. Voss did not. His eyes moved past Seela to the man standing behind her, taking in the mended shirt, the healing bruises still yellow along his jaw, with open, assessing suspicion. "This the fellow you've been keeping?" Voss asked. "Doesn't look near dead to me anymore." "He's healing," Seela said. "I don't imagine that troubles you as much as my land does, Mr. Voss, so I'd ask you to say your piece about the note and leave the rest of my household out of it." Voss's jaw tightened at being read so plainly, and he turned his horse without further courtesy, Halsey trailing apologetically behind him. But Em's hand found the small of her back once they'd gone, steady and warm, and she understood without either of them saying it that whatever came at the first frost, she would not be facing it entirely alone anymore. "He wants the water bad enough to bring a banker to do his talking," Em said quietly, once the dust of their leaving had settled. "That's not a man confident of winning fair, Seela. That's a man in a hurry." "I've thought the same," Seela admitted. I don't know what he's in a hurry toward. I only know I don't intend to make it easy for him. The memory returned to him whole on a gray October morning, 3 days before the note's deadline, when the sound of hoofbeats on the road pulled him sharply upright at the window, his face gone pale and rigid in a way Selah had never seen. "Riders," he said, "4 of them. Selah, get the rifle." She had learned enough of him by then to trust the fear in his voice without question. She had the old rifle down from over the door and loaded before the riders reached the yard, and it was only when they drew close enough to make out faces that M's shoulders dropped in something between relief and dread. "Whitcomb," he said, and the name came out of him whole this time, followed by the rest of it in a single flooding rush. His own name, his own life, a great cattle operation spanning 3 counties, a business partner turned rival who had grown tired of waiting to inherit influence and had arranged, on a lonely stretch of road 2 months before, to have him robbed of everything that named him and thrown to a creek to die quietly and be forgotten. "My God, Selah, my name is Emmett Rademacher." The name meant nothing to Selah beyond the fact of it, but it meant everything to the lean, gray-suited man swinging down off his horse in her dooryard, who took one look at M's face and went the color of old ash. "Mr. Rademacher," Whitcomb said, his voice cracking, "we buried an empty coffin 2 months ago. Delford Ash told the board you were dead, told them you'd fallen from the Colton Bridge in a storm, and inside a week he'd talked the board into naming himself acting director of every operation you own. We've been searching every county between here and the territorial line since the first week, sir, on nothing but a hope." Selah stood in her own dooryard with a rifle still cradled in her arms, watching the stranger she had nursed through a fever and fallen in love with by inches reassemble himself, in the space of 5 minutes, into one of the wealthiest men in the territory, and felt the ground of her own life tilt beneath her in a way that frightened her more than Garrett Voss's threats ever had. "Rademacher Cattle and Freight," Whitcomb was saying, still talking to M in the clipped, urgent shorthand of a man who had rehearsed this reunion 100 times in his head and found it nothing like he'd imagined. 3 counties of grazing contracts, the freight line to the capital, the bank's own largest depositor, sir. Half the territory has been quietly mourning you for 2 months, and the other half has been quietly maneuvering to profit from it." Selah listened to the list of counties, contracts, a bank's largest depositor, and felt something small and honest inside her go very still and very careful, the way a woman braces herself for a door she suspects is about to close. She had fallen in love, she realized standing there, with a man named M who mended fences one-handed and hummed off-key, and grieved a stranger's dead husband with her at the supper table. She did not yet know what to do with a man named Emmett Rademacher, and she was honest enough with herself to be frightened of the distance those 2 names might yet prove to hold between them. He must have seen it in her face, because he turned from Whitcomb before the foreman had finished speaking and crossed the yard to her, ignoring the collarbone that still ached at sudden movement. "Don't," he said quietly, taking the rifle gently from her arms and setting it against the porch rail. "Look at me as though the name changes what happened in that front room. I am the same man who couldn't recall his own name and found, waking, that yours was the only steady thing in the whole world. Money doesn't undo that, Selah. It only means I can finally offer you something back for it." "I didn't nurse you for an offer," Selah said, her voice not quite steady. "I know," M said. "That is precisely why I intend to make one anyway." "He'll come for you," M said to Whitcomb, his voice gone hard and clear in a way Selah hadn't heard from him before. "Ash knows he never confirmed the kill. If word reaches him I'm alive before we reach the capital, he'll try again, and he won't be careless enough to leave me in a creek a second time." He was right. Word reached Delford Ash within 2 days, carried, Sela later learned, by a hired man of Garrett Voss's who had seen Whitcomb's riders and put two and two together, for the price of a drink for Voss. It turned out, had done business with Ash before, buying up cheap land the syndicate wanted to seize once Rademacher's holdings fell into new hands, and he had every reason of his own to want the truth buried again. They came at night, 4 riders under a thin moon, and Sela woke to the sound of her dog barking itself hoarse, and M, already at the window, with the rifle she'd taught him to load one-handed during his recovery. "Get down," he said. "Sela the root cellar now." "I'll not hide in a cellar while men shoot at my own house," Sela said, and there was no arguing with the flatness of her voice, because she had spent 3 winters alone defending this homestead against wolves and weather and worse, and she was not about to abandon it to strangers now, not even for the sake of the man she loved. What followed was the longest hour of her life, M firing warning shots from the front window, while Sela held the rear of the house with her husband's old shotgun, the riders circling twice in the dark before one grew bold enough to fire back, splintering the doorframe a hand's width from her shoulder. And it was that shot, close enough to feel the wind of it, that steadied rather than frightened her, because fear, she found, had a floor beneath it. And once you struck that floor, there was nothing left to do but stand. "Sela," M's voice cracked across the dark house, tight with a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety. "Are you hit?" "I'm whole," she called back, though her hands were shaking so badly she had to steady the shotgun stock against the windowsill to keep her aim true. "Mind your own window, Emmett Rademacher, and let me mind mine." She heard, absurdly, something that might almost have been a laugh from the front room, startled out of him by fear and love in equal measure. And then the night went to noise again, hoofbeats, a shout, the crack of M's rifle answered by return fire that tore a long splinter from the porch post. And Sela understood, crouched at her own back window with her dead husband's shotgun steady in her grip, that she had built a life twice now on the willingness to stand her ground when easier women would have run. And she was not about to let this be the night that broke the habit. It was Whitcomb's men, camped a half-mile off in case of exactly this, who came riding in at the sound of gunfire, and turned the tide before real tragedy could be made of it. 2 of Ash's hired riders taken at gunpoint, the other 2 fled into the dark, and by dawn the whole ugly business lay exposed for the law to sort through, Ash's scheme unraveling from Dry Bluff to the territorial capital within the week once M's testimony, and Whitcomb's ledgers, and the confession of one frightened, cornered rider were laid before a judge. Garrett Voss left the territory inside a month, once his dealings with Ash's syndicate came to light, and the note on Sela's homestead bought up quietly. She learned, as part of the very land grab Voss had hoped Ash's syndicate would help him complete, was declared void by the same court that unraveled the rest of the scheme. "You never asked me for any of this," M said, standing with her in the dooryard a week later, the note that had haunted her for 2 years now ash in the cookstove behind them, his collarbone healed straight, his gray suit traded back for the plain shirt she'd mended for him a dozen times over. Not the money, not the note forgiven, not one word of gratitude for a fortune you had every right to expect, having saved the life that carries it. "I didn't pull you out of that creek for a fortune," Sela said. "I pulled you out because you were a person dying, and I'd made myself a promise. Whatever you are, cattleman or pauper, that would have been true either way." "I know it," M said quietly. "That is precisely why I mean to spend the rest of my life making certain you never regret it." He took her hand, the same hand that had held a rifle steady through the worst hour of her life, and pressed it between both of his own. "I have more money than any 10 men could spend honestly, Sela Pruitt, and not $1 of it means as much to me as the 4 you had left the night you decided I was worth saving. marry me. Not because I owe you a debt, though I do, and not because it would be convenient, though it would be that to marry me because I have not drawn one easy breath since that first fever-clear night I opened my eyes and found your face was the last thing between me and dying. And I find I have no wish to spend the rest of my days without it being the first thing I see each morning instead. Selah looked at him a long moment, the richest man in the territory, standing in her poor dooryard in a mended shirt, offering her his whole life with the same plain honesty he'd offered her his fear the night the riders came, and found that her answer had been settled somewhere back in the mud of that creek bank, long before either of them had known his name. "Then yes," she said, "though I'll tell you plainly, Emmett Rademacher, I'd have kept you even if you turned out to be nobody at all." "I know," he said, and it was that certainty, more than any fortune, that he carried with him gladly into every ordinary morning of the life they built together after.